Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the American South. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this narration. Charleston, 1842. A society governed by rigid hierarchies and unspoken boundaries. When Colonel Jeremiah Winthrop, master of Magnolia Hill Plantation, succumbed to fever that February, his widow Eleanor vanished from social circles. The colonel's death came swiftly despite his robust constitution, the fever claiming him after 3 weeks of declining health, during which the household physician, Dr. Harrison Mills, documented in his medical journal a peculiar resistance to all traditional remedies. Throughout this ordeal, the colonel's personal servant, Isaiah, a man of unusual education and dignity among the enslaved population, remained constantly at his bedside, administering tinctures and compresses with methodical precision, while the physician observed that the patient appeared to respond more favorably to Isaiah's ministrations than his own. The funeral, held beneath the moss-draped oaks of St. Philip's churchyard, drew Charleston's most distinguished families, the Pinckneys, Rutledges, and Middletons among them, all bearing witness to the unusual composure of the widow, her pale features betraying neither grief nor distress as she received condolences with distant politeness. Several attendees later recalled in letters and diary entries their discomfort upon observing Mrs. Winthrop engaged in hushed conversation with Isaiah immediately following the service, her gloved hand briefly touching his sleeve in a gesture deemed inappropriately familiar. More disturbing still were the events that transpired the following morning, when Eleanor gathered the household staff in Magnolia Hill's cavernous entrance hall, the portrait of her late husband looming above as she announced with unwavering authority that henceforth Isaiah would oversee the plantation's operations, a declaration that prompted the immediate resignation of Mr. Thornton, the white overseer who had managed the property's 73 enslaved workers for over a decade and sent tremors of scandal through Charleston society that would soon erupt into open outrage. The absence of Mrs. Eleanor Winthrop from Charleston's spring social season of 1842 became a subject of intense speculation. Her empty chair at the Rutledges' annual garden party particularly noted, as it had been a tradition for the Winthrops to attend for 15 consecutive years. A testimony recorded by the Freedmen's Bureau in 1867 from Lucinda, a house servant who had worked at Magnolia Hill, revealed that within 3 weeks of the colonel's funeral, Eleanor had dismissed almost the entire white household staff, the housekeeper, the groundskeeper, and even her personal lady's maid, all replaced by enslaved workers who now occupied positions traditionally reserved for white employees. Letters exchanged between Mrs. Catherine Pinckney and Mrs. Harriet Alston, preserved in the Charleston Historical Society's collection, expressed alarm at Eleanor's formal rejection of invitations to no fewer than 7 prominent social gatherings, her written excuses citing persistent grief, though rumors suggested she had been observed riding the plantation's boundaries in full health, accompanied always by Isaiah. Most disturbing to Charleston society was the diary entry of Miss Margaret Bradford, Eleanor's second cousin, who recorded her shock upon visiting Magnolia Hill, unannounced in April, and witnessing Isaiah standing on the main house's veranda, ledger in hand, issuing harvest directives to 3 white workers who complied without protest, a scene so contrary to established order that Margaret departed immediately, recording that she scarce recognized the cousin I had known since childhood. So transformed was she by whatever spell this unusual servant had cast. Despite Eleanor's physical absence from Charleston affairs, financial records examined a century later by economic historians revealed that Magnolia Hill's productivity actually increased during this period, with cotton yields surpassing previous harvests and new commercial arrangements secured with northern textile manufacturers who, according to surviving correspondence, dealt exclusively with Mr. Isaiah Winthrop, plantation manager, a title that appeared on business documents but existed nowhere within South Carolina's legal framework, where Isaiah remained classified as property belonging to the estate of Colonel Jeremiah Winthrop. a paradox that would soon draw dangerous attention from those dedicated to maintaining Charleston's rigid social hierarchy. On the morning of the 17th of June, 1842, Thomas Blackwood, a methodical clerk who had served in Charleston's courthouse for 23 years without incident, discovered among a stack of recently filed documents what would later be described in his private diary as a textual abomination that shook the very foundations of my understanding of Charleston society. The document in question, a marriage certificate bearing the elegant signature of Eleanor Winthrop and the surprisingly refined handwriting of a man identified simply as Isaiah, had been officiated by Reverend Josiah Abernathy of Massachusetts, whose name appeared in port records as having visited Charleston for only 6 days in April, aboard the merchant vessel Northern Star. Contemporary accounts from the harbor master's log indicate Reverend Abernathy had declared his visit's purpose as Christian missionary work among the destitute, providing no indication of his participation in what would constitute a criminal act under South Carolina law. Blackwood's personal diary, discovered by his granddaughter in 1903 and subsequently donated to the Charleston Historical Society, reveals that for 11 days he kept the document locked in his private desk drawer, his entries during this period reflecting profound moral turmoil as he weighed his duty to the legal system against his long acquaintance with the respected Winthrop family. I find myself in possession of a document that, if authentic, represents not merely a violation of state law, but a desecration of our entire social fabric, Blackwood wrote on June 23. Yet I cannot reconcile myself to being the instrument of Mrs. Winthrop's destruction, having watched her grow from childhood and believing her to be a woman of otherwise impeccable character. The diary further chronicles his eventual decision to make 3 handwritten copies of the certificate, which he distributed anonymously to Judge William Harrington, Reverend Thomas Porter of St. Michael's Church, and Senator George Middleton, all men of considerable influence whose reactions, Blackwood reasoned, would determine whether justice or mercy would prevail in what would inevitably become the most scandalous case in Charleston's collective memory. The excavation conducted at Magnolia Hill Plantation in 2010 by archaeologists from the University of South Carolina uncovered a weathered metal box beneath the floorboards of what historical records identified as Colonel Winthrop's private study, its contents preserved remarkably well within the sealed container that had evidently been concealed with deliberate care. Among the findings, most significant was a collection of 27 letters exchanged between the Colonel and prominent Northern abolitionists, including correspondence with William Lloyd Garrison, whose publication The Liberator had been banned throughout the South since 1831 for its radical anti-slavery position. More revelatory still were the Colonel's business ledgers, spanning the period from 1835 to 1841, in which Dr. Amelia Richardson, a financial historian specializing in antebellum commerce, identified a pattern of transactions disguised as agricultural investments, but which aligned precisely with known funding dates for Underground Railroad operations in Virginia and North Carolina. These ledgers suggest Colonel Winthrop maintained a public persona as a defender of Southern institutions while privately directing significant financial resources, approximately $37,000 in today's Colonel-rected currency, toward efforts explicitly designed to undermine those same institutions, noted Dr. Richardson in her 2012 analysis published in the Journal of Southern Economic History. Most poignant among the discoveries was a leather-bound journal, its final entry dated merely 3 days before the Colonel's fatal illness, in which Jeremiah Winthrop had written with evident anguish about his evolving moral position. I find myself increasingly unable to reconcile the Christian principles I profess with the human property I possess, particularly as I observe in Isaiah an intelligence and dignity that refutes every justification upon which our peculiar institution stands. The journal further detailed clandestine conversations between the Colonel and Isaiah. During the year preceding his death, discussions focused on philosophical questions of natural rights and human equality. Conversations that, if discovered during his lifetime, would have resulted in the Colonel's complete social ostracism from the very Charleston society in which he had once been a respected patriarch. These archaeological findings cast an entirely new light on the circumstances surrounding Eleanor's subsequent actions, suggesting that perhaps her remarkable choices following her husband's death represented not a departure from his values but rather the fulfillment of intentions he had lacked the courage to implement during his lifetime. The bill of sale discovered among the Winthrop family papers, housed in the Virginia Historical Society, reveals that on the 12th of September 1835, Colonel Jeremiah Winthrop purchased Isaiah not through the customary Charleston slave auction but through private arrangement with Thornfield Plantation in Albemarle County, Virginia, paying the extraordinary sum of $1,800, approximately 3 times the typical price for an enslaved male of similar age and physical condition. This unusual transaction prompted Dr. Eliza Montgomery, researching antebellum education patterns in 1978, to investigate further, leading to her remarkable discovery within the sealed archives of Oberlin College. A record indicating that a student identified only as I.W. from Virginia had attended clandestine night classes between 1831 and 1834. His tuition paid by an anonymous benefactor who correspondence suggested was a conscience-stricken scion of a prominent Southern family. The college records described this mysterious student as a young man of conscience, exceptional intellectual gifts whose circumstances necessitate absolute discretion, with faculty notes praising his particular aptitude for languages, philosophy, and mathematics despite his abbreviated formal education. The most controversial insight into Isaiah's background emerged from an interview conducted by journalist Howard Phillips with Adeline Johnson, who at 103 years of age in 1901 claimed to have been a house servant at Thornfield during her youth, where she became privy to closely guarded family secrets. "That boy Isaiah weren't no ordinary slave," the transcript quotes her as saying. "He was born to the master's wife's sister and the master himself, making him half-brother to the very man who later purchased him." According to Johnson's testimony, published posthumously in the Atlantic Monthly in 1907, Isaiah's mother had died in childbirth, after which his father, consumed by guilt and fear of scandal, sold his own son into slavery at age 16, when the resemblance between them became too pronounced to ignore, a narrative corroborated by facial comparison analysis conducted in 2015 between surviving portraits of Colonel Winthrop's father and a daguerreotype believed to depict Isaiah, which identified 17 distinct physiognomic similarities consistent with close biological relationship. This revelation cast the subsequent events at Magnolia Hill in an even more complex light, suggesting that Colonel Winthrop may have purchased Isaiah not merely as an act of conscience, but as an attempt to rectify a profound family injustice that had relegated his own half-brother to human chattel. The discovery of a cedar chest in the attic of Margaret Bradford's Boston home in 1875 yielded a collection of letters spanning 20 years of correspondence with her younger sister Eleanor, casting new light on the woman who would become Charleston's most notorious widow. Born Eleanor Catherine Hathaway in 1816 to a prosperous Massachusetts textile manufacturer with known connections to the early abolitionist movement, her letters reveal she received an unusually comprehensive education at Miss Porter's Female Seminary, where she studied literature, languages, and natural philosophy alongside New England's intellectual elite. Financial records indicate a severe reversal of fortune in 1837, culminating in an arrangement whereby 19-year-old Eleanor's hand in marriage was exchanged for significant investment from 47-year-old Colonel Jeremiah Winthrop, securing the Hathaway Mill from bankruptcy. Her private correspondence, particularly letters dated between 1839 and 1841, chronicles her growing moral distress at plantation life, with one passage lamenting, "I find myself complicit in a system my conscience cannot bear to contemplate. Surrounded by suffering I am powerless to alleviate without undermining the husband whose protection I require." Most revealing was the testimony of Martha Washington Jones, formerly enslaved as Magnolia Hill's head cook, who in an 1867 interview described observing numerous occasions when, during the Colonel's frequent business travels to Charleston, Eleanor and Isaiah would meet in the plantation library, where they would sit for hours, heads bent together over books no slave was supposed to read, discussing ideas that would have scandalized the master had he known. Jones further recalled witnessing Eleanor surreptitiously teaching Isaiah to write in French and Latin, languages the colonel did not speak, creating a private means of communication between them through marginalia in shared volumes of Rousseau and Voltaire. According to Jones, these intellectual exchanges eventually evolved into a bond of understanding unlike any I ever witnessed between white and colored folk. Though she insisted that no impropriety occurred until after the colonel had been laid in his grave, a claim that subsequent events would call into question. The 3 copies of the marriage certificate distributed by Thomas Blackwood in late June 1842 multiplied through Charleston's elite circles with alarming speed. Each subsequent transcription accompanied by increasingly inflammatory marginalia, suggesting conspiracies far beyond the document's already shocking contents. Councilman Edward Rutledge's leather-bound diary, preserved in Charleston's municipal archives, records that on the 3rd of August 1842, an emergency meeting was convened at midnight in the back room of Street Cecilia Society's hall, attended by 23 of the city's most influential men who debated for 4 hours what one participant termed the most dangerous precedent since Denmark Vesey's insurrection. Financial records from Plus. Winthrop Cotton Factors, the colonel's primary business enterprise, document that between August 5 and August 17 prominent families withdrew their accounts entirely, while the Charleston Mercury published a thinly veiled editorial condemning certain anomalous domestic arrangements that threaten the very foundations upon which our civilization rests. Most revealing of the personal betrayal felt by Charleston society was a letter discovered in 2003 from Mrs. Constance Pinckney to her sister in Savannah, in which she wrote, "I cannot reconcile my present horror with the woman who sat at my table no fewer than 30 times, accepted my hospitality, embraced my children, all while harboring sentiments that, had they been known, would have made her presence beneath my roof unthinkable." The letter continues with particular vitriol regarding Eleanor's deception, noting, "It is not merely the unnatural union itself, but the years of calculated pretense that preceded it which I cannot forgive. To think that while she nodded in agreement with our defense of Southern institutions, she was secretly cultivating beliefs that would destroy them." Parish records from St. Philip's Church indicate that on August 20, Reverend William Porter delivered a sermon entitled "The Sanctity of Natural Boundaries," attended by virtually every prominent family in Charleston except the Winthrops, in which he denounced those who would violate divine law through ungodly unions, and called for swift and righteous consequence for any who would subvert the God-ordained order of our society. Language that, according to contemporary accounts, was understood by all present as direct authorization for whatever measures might be deemed necessary to address the scandal that threatened to undermine Charleston's most fundamental social structures. On the 12th of September, 1842, courthouse records document the arrival of a delegation comprising 7 of Charleston's most prominent citizens at Magnolia Hill Plantation, their purpose recorded euphemistically as addressing a matter of community concern regarding the management of the Winthrop estate. The testimony of Samuel Johnson, the plantation's elderly gardener, recorded by the Freedmen's Bureau in 1866, provides the only first-hand account of what transpired when Judge William Harrington, accompanied by Sheriff Thomas Grimball, 2 city councilmen, Reverend Porter, and 2 plantation owners, arrived to find Eleanor and Isaiah awaiting them in the main house's formal parlor. They was seated side by side on the settee, not touching but equal-like, with Mrs. Winthrop wearing her best blue silk dress, and Isaiah in a fine coat I never seen before, Johnson recalled. And when the gentleman entered, expecting her to dismiss him, she instead introduced Isaiah as her husband, and invited them all to be seated, as though it were the most natural thing in God's creation. The delegation's reaction, according to Johnson, transformed from initial shock to volcanic outrage when Eleanor produced the original marriage certificate and calmly asserted its legality under Massachusetts law, prompting Judge Harrington to declare, "No Northern paper overrules the laws of South Carolina," while Reverend Porter reportedly turned his back entirely, refusing to look upon what he termed an abomination in the eyes of the Lord. Court documents filed the following morning in Charleston detail charges of moral turpitude, violation of racial integrity, statutes, and incitement to insurrection against Eleanor, while Isaiah faced accusations of impersonating a free person, seditious conspiracy, and violation of proper station, all capital offenses in 1842nd South Carolina. The Charleston Courier's September 14 edition contained only an oblique reference to a distressing situation discovered at a prominent Ashley River plantation requiring judicial intervention, while the Mercury alluded to arrangements contrary to natural order that have necessitated swift legal remedy to preserve our sacred institutions. Neither publication daring to explicitly state that a well-born white woman had claimed an enslaved man as her lawful husband, a concept so fundamentally threatening to the entire social structure that even in condemnation, direct acknowledgement remained taboo. Charleston police records dated the 3rd of October 1842 document Sheriff Grimball's arrival at Magnolia Hill with 4 deputies and a warrant for the immediate arrest of both Eleanor Winthrop and the slave known as Isaiah, only to discover the main house abandoned, with no trace of either individual despite an exhaustive search of the property's outbuildings and surrounding woods. The mystery of their disappearance remained unsolved until 1930, when maritime historian Theodore Marshall discovered the logbook of Captain Jeremiah Howland of the merchant vessel Northern Light, which recorded that on October 1, a Mrs. Elizabeth Johnson and her manservant Samuel had booked private passage to Boston, paying an unusually generous fee of $40 in gold for discretion regarding their circumstances and origins. The physical descriptions noted by the meticulous captain, a fair-haired lady of refined and beyond, bearing approximately 25 years of age, and an educated colored man of about 30 years with unusual fluency in both French and Latin, leave little doubt as to the passengers' true identities. Charleston County property records reveal that between August 25 and September 28, Eleanor had quietly executed sales of 3 peripheral sections of Magnolia Hill, totaling 175 acres to neighboring plantations, transactions conducted through her attorney under the pretext of estate consolidation, but which converted nearly 30% of the Winthrop holdings into $12,700 in cash, an amount precisely matching the anonymous donation received by the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society on the 15th of November 1842. Further evidence of the couple's northern reception emerged in a letter discovered in the Bradford family papers, written by Eleanor's cousin Margaret to her friend Abigail Alcott in Concord, dated the 12th of September 1842, which mentioned preparations for special guests from the South, whose circumstances necessitate the utmost discretion, and whose presence in our community must remain unacknowledged in any public fashion, as their safety depends entirely upon the successful abandonment of their former identities. The letter continues with coded language about arranging appropriate employment for the gentleman that will utilize his considerable intellectual gifts without exposing him to undue scrutiny, and securing a modest but comfortable cottage on the outskirts of town where our friends might establish a new life unburdened by the constraints that made their previous situation untenable. Arrangements that would soon transform the fugitive couple from Charleston scandal to abolitionist legend. Court proceedings against Eleanor Winthrop and Isaiah commenced in absentia on the 8th of November, 1842, with Judge Harrington declaring from the bench that the defendant's flight constitutes admission of guilt in this most heinous matter. Legal documents preserved in the Charleston County Archives reveal that on November 23, the court formally stripped Eleanor of all rights to the Winthrop estate, with ownership of Magnolia Hill and its remaining 73 enslaved persons reverting to Colonel Winthrop's cousin, Brigadier General Thomas Winthrop of Virginia, who immediately instituted what overseer records described as a regime of unprecedented discipline to purge the plantation of corrupting influences. The Charleston Mercury published a series of increasingly strident editorials throughout December 1842, with the December 17 edition warning that the infiltration of Northern sentiments into Southern households represents an existential threat more insidious than any military action. While the Southern Quarterly Review devoted its entire January 1843 issue to examining the dangerous consequences of educating those not suited by natural capacity or divine order to receive such instruction. Parish records from St. Philip's Church dated the 5th of December, 1842, document Eleanor's formal excommunication in a ceremony attended by over 300 congregants, during which Reverend Porter declared her dead to the community of faithful Christians and condemned to eternal separation from God's grace, unless genuine repentance and public renunciation of her sins be forthcoming. Most consequential was the Ashley River Compact, established through correspondence between 12 prominent plantation owners, which imposed severe new restrictions, including the prohibition of any male slave entering a white household without another white person present, the banning of all reading materials in slave quarters, immediate sale of any enslaved person suspected of literacy, and the requirement that white women be accompanied by a male relative beyond the main house gardens. The South Carolina legislature subsequently codified these practices into the Domestic Security Act of 1843, citing the Winthrop incident as evidence that extraordinary vigilance is required to maintain the sacred boundaries upon which our entire civilization depends. The 1850 Federal Census of Concord, Massachusetts, contains the first documented evidence of Eleanor and Isaiah's new life, listing Elizabeth and Samuel Johnson as residents of a modest cottage on the town's northern outskirts, their ages, places of birth, and physical descriptions closely matching the fugitive couple, despite the altered names. The Concord Freeman's April 1851 edition includes a brief notice announcing the establishment of a small academy for the education of colored persons recently arrived from Southern territories, operated by Mrs. Johnson, formerly of Charleston, and her husband, a man of considerable erudition despite the circumstances of his earlier life. The careful phrasing suggesting the newspaper editor understood the couple's true identity while maintaining the protective fiction necessary for their safety. Correspondence between William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, preserved in the Boston Athenaeum's abolitionist collection, references a private gathering in November 1851, where the Charleston couple provided testimony described as so powerful in its emotional truth and so damning in its first-hand account of Southern hypocrisy that several ladies present were overcome and required smelling salts, while the gentlemen sat in stunned silence before erupting in renewed commitment to our cause. Financial records from the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society indicate that between 1842 and 1845, the organization provided the Johnsons with quarterly stipends totaling $1,200, gradually reducing support as the couple established financial independence through their educational endeavors. A letter from Harriet Beecher Stowe to her sister in 1852 reveals that certain passages in the then unpublished manuscript of Uncle Tom's Cabin were directly inspired by the extraordinary narrative shared by Mrs. J., whose personal experience of plantation life and subsequent moral courage in rejecting its comforts makes her testimony particularly valuable. The Concord property deed, transferred to Samuel and Elizabeth Johnson in 1853, represents the first legal document in American history, knowingly executed for a married couple consisting of a white woman and a formerly enslaved black man, a fact acknowledged only in the private diary of the town clerk, who wrote, "Today I participated in a small act of revolution, recognizing under law what our Creator has already blessed, though I shall surely face divine judgment should my role in this deception ever become known to those from whom these good people fled." In 1967, historian Dr. Rebecca Townsend uncovered an extraordinary document while researching antebellum Charleston at the University of South Carolina archives. A hotel register from the Planters Inn dated the 12th of March 1858, bearing the signature Mrs. Margaret Williams of Philadelphia, alongside a receipt for a 3-night stay whose handwriting analysis later confirmed matched Eleanor Winthrop's distinctive script. This discovery prompted further investigation, leading to the testimony of Jeremiah Taylor, son of a Magnolia Hill house servant, recorded by the Works Progress Administration in 1937, who recalled his mother describing a veiled widow lady who came in darkness to visit old Mrs. Winthrop as she lay dying, staying only long enough to hold her mother's hand before disappearing again like a ghost from the old stories. The most revealing evidence emerged in 1972 when the Massachusetts Historical Society acquired a collection of Johnson family papers containing a water-stained letter posted from Richmond, dated March 18, 1858, in which Eleanor wrote to Isaiah, "My dearest, I scarcely recognize the city of my former life. Charleston stands physically unchanged, its white columns and garden walls pristine as ever, yet it feels suffocated beneath an atmosphere of tension and suspicion that did not exist when we departed 16 years ago. Armed patrols now question every unfamiliar face, and conversations in public places fall silent at the mention of northern states." The letter continues with poignant reflection. "Standing unrecognized at the edge of my mother's funeral, watching as those who once called me friend passed within inches of me, I understood with painful finality that we shall never again walk freely in the place of our beginning. What we have built in our modest northern life represents a truer liberty than any I knew beneath Magnolia Hill's grand facade." Most intriguing was her cryptic reference to having successfully retrieved the package from beneath the third floorboard in the library's eastern corner. Just as Jeremiah described before his passing, the contents are more significant than even he realized, and I shall guard them with my life until we are reunited, as they represent not merely our past, but a future that others like us might someday claim openly before God and society. Military records from the Massachusetts 54th Regiment, the famed Black Infantry Unit, immortalized for its valor at Fort Wagner, list Samuel Johnson, age 51. Occupation teacher. Among those who enlisted on the 23rd of May, 1863, his medical examination noting, "a man of exceptional physical condition despite his advanced years, bearing evidence of old injuries consistent with plantation discipline." Concurrently, Boston City Hospital employment records document Elizabeth Johnson joining the nursing corps under Dorothea Dix's supervision. Her supervisor's notes praising her unusual composure when confronted with the most grievous wounds and particular effectiveness in calming delirious soldiers from southern states through her intimate knowledge of their regional dialects and customs. 3 letters exchanged between them during this period, discovered in Union Colonel Robert Gould, Shaw's personal effects collected after his death and preserved by his family until their donation to Harvard University in 1943. Reveal their conviction that the conflict represented divine judgment upon the institution that had defined their earlier lives. Perhaps it is fitting that I now tend the broken bodies of men from Charleston plantations who do not recognize in their nurse the woman once considered a demon in their childhood stories, Eleanor wrote in August 1863, while Isaiah's response from the battlefield observed, "Each foot of southern soil taken by troops that include men who once worked that same ground as property represents a transformation more profound than any legislation could accomplish." Most poignant was Eleanor's Possimo diary entry dated the 12th of February, 1865, following news of General Sherman's troops burning Magnolia Hill Plantation during their destructive march through South Carolina. "I find myself gripped by emotions I cannot fully comprehend. Profound sorrow for the beauty destroyed, the ancient oaks and gardens reduced to ash. Relief that the physical edifice of our bondage no longer stands, and an unexpected sense of loss for the place where, despite everything, I first experienced love that transcended the boundaries constructed to prevent it." Perhaps it is fitting that the war consuming the South should erase even the memory of where our impossible journey began, leaving only what we ourselves have built from the ashes of that former existence. The leather-bound journal containing Father Michael O'Connor's account of Eleanor Johnson's final confession, sealed in the Boston Archdiocese archives until 1950, as stipulated in her last wishes, revealed startling details about the relationship that had scandalized Charleston 4 decades earlier. She spoke with remarkable clarity for one so near death. The priest recorded, confessing that her relationship with Isaiah began 3 years before Colonel Winthrop's passing. With the colonel's full knowledge and implicit blessing, arrangement she described as a compact between 3 souls trapped within institutions none of us had created, but which we lacked the public courage to reject openly. According to Father O'Connor's meticulous notes, Eleanor revealed that Colonel Winthrop, upon learning of his terminal condition in 1841, had actually facilitated their legal marriage through his northern connections, viewing it as atonement for his family's role in separating Isaiah from his rightful place as a Winthrop heir. Isaiah's own final testament, executed in November 1879 following his death from pneumonia, directed his attorney to deliver a sealed iron box to the Charleston Historical Society in January 1900, with explicit instructions that its contents remain unopened until the new century, when perhaps Americans might view its contents with eyes unclouded by the prejudices that have defined our nation's greatest moral failure. When finally opened by Society curator Dr. William Barnwell at the specified time, the box yielded 6 separate marriage certificates dating between 1821 and 1851, each documenting a union between a plantation mistress and an enslaved man, accompanied by letters, daguerreotypes, and journal entries chronicling relationships that had remained completely hidden from historical record. Most remarkable was a parchment map of South Carolina, with 27 locations marked in faded ink, each representing what an accompanying key identified as stations of the Hart's Underground Railroad, plantations where forbidden relationships had flourished despite laws forbidding them, suggesting that the Winthrop scandal represented merely the visible peak of a much larger phenomenon of resistance against the artificial boundaries between people that slavery had attempted to enforce. The document concluded with Isaiah's handwritten note: "Let future generations understand that where there are systems designed to prevent human connection, there will always be those who defy them, not as acts of rebellion, but because the heart recognizes no law but its own." The groundbreaking genetic study published in the American Journal of Historical Anthropology in 2018 identified 37 living Americans whose DNA profiles contain genetic markers specifically linking them to both Eleanor Hathaway Winthrop and Isaiah, their lineage dispersed across 17 states from Massachusetts to California, with most descendants entirely unaware of their connection to what historian Dr. Amelia Richardson termed the most extraordinary documented case of boundary crossing in the antebellum South. Concurrent archaeological excavations at the Magnolia Hill plantation site, conducted by the University of South Carolina, uncovered a sophisticated system of architectural modifications, including a false wall in the library, concealing a small reading chamber accessible through both the main house and the adjacent servant quarters, along with a hidden passage beneath the plantation's ornamental garden, leading to a subterranean room containing fragments of books, writing implements, and personal effects suggesting years of clandestine meetings before their public union. The discovery prompted a contentious 2019 symposium at Harvard University, where historians debated whether the Winthrop case represented an extraordinary anomaly or merely the most visible example of a more widespread phenomenon of intimate relationships across racial boundaries in the plantation South, with Dr. Thomas Jefferson Morrison arguing. Each discovery challenging our assumptions about rigid separation in this period forces us to reconsider the complex reality beneath the South's carefully maintained social facade. The most emotionally powerful artifact emerged in 2022 when Boston University doctoral student Eliza Johnson, herself a direct descendant of the couple, discovered while clearing her recently deceased grandmother's attic a metal case containing a remarkably preserved daguerreotype dated 1864, depicting an elderly Isaiah in Union Army uniform standing proudly beside Eleanor in nurse's attire, their hands openly intertwined, with the Massachusetts State House visible through the window behind them, the first and only known image of the couple together, directly contradicting the historical assumption that Isaiah had died early in the Civil War. The photograph's inscription on its reverse, written in Eleanor's distinctive hand, offers a fitting epitaph for their extraordinary journey. What Charleston deemed impossible, Boston witnesses daily. Proof that hearts may recognize each other's truth even when laws and customs deny it. And perhaps someday our grandchildren's grandchildren will inhabit a world where such recognition requires neither courage nor sacrifice.